Well, good evening and welcome. So glad that you're here. My name is Daniel Gilman, and I'm coming to you from my living room here in Toronto, Canada. I want to alert you to a couple different boxes if you're watching on Zoom. If you're on YouTube, it'll work a little bit differently, but I know we have a few more guests than we normally do, and that's just absolutely wonderful. If you're on Zoom, if you're watching this live, then you have a Q&A box. My dad, our speaker tonight and every week, is going to be taking your questions. So please use the Q&A box for submitting questions. And if you are participating in a chat with us, in a few moments, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd love to hear your response for this icebreaker. Please do so in the chat box. If you're using the chat box, however, not Q&A, when you use a chat box, you need to actually choose to be writing to panelists and attendees. If you just write to panelists, and people do every week, no judgment. If you write to panelists, it only comes to my dad and I. So you want to click panelists and attendees when you reply to my question. Like I said, my name is Daniel. I am my father's son, biology, and I'm emceeing. He's speaking tonight. My dad, Alan Gilman, is going to be sharing his life story. He's going to be sharing vulnerably with us. It's something that I have always loved about my dad. His entire life, my entire life, he is someone who is very honest and vulnerable, not putting political spin or photoshopping pieces of his story, but he's very vulnerable as he shares who he is and how he came to be here. We're really glad for everyone who's tuned in, whether on Zoom or YouTube. And I want to ask you, tuning in from all over the world, if you would answer this question before my dad comes up. Please let us know where you're tuning in from when you respond to this question. So if the answer is Corrie ten Boom, New York, New York, that's the answer. The question is, what biography inspires you? What is your favorite biography or autobiography? Is there a life story of someone that just so inspires you? This is your favorite story. Thought this would be a relevant icebreaker tonight as we listen to my dad's story. In a sense, I guess it's autobiography tonight. So please put in the chat box your favorite biography, someone who inspires you, their life story, and also let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat box. That would be absolutely wonderful. Without any further ado, I'd like to give a warm digital welcome to my dad, Alan Gilman.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, hello, everyone. This is a special evening. This is our normal night for our Old Testament course that we've been doing, week 17 out of 20. And we've been looking at the books of the prophets in the Old Testament. And I was preparing a special section on the messianic prophecies, that aspect of Scripture that predicts the coming of the Messiah. And so because of the profound effect that the messianic prophecies had in my life, in leading me to believe that Jesus, Yeshua in Hebrew, is the promised Jewish Messiah, I thought I would speak about the messianic prophecies in the context of my own story. So I also thought that because of the nature of this kind of presentation, I thought it would be appropriate to invite anybody and everybody who wants to come. So normally this is a course for the people who have been attending, and there's about 60 to 70 people that have been signing on live every week, and others watch the recording later on YouTube. And this too will be available, if everything goes well, be available on YouTube after. But we thought we'd invite the world. So welcome, world, wherever you are, whoever you are, also watching on YouTube. And so Daniel is my guy who looks at all the questions and goes through them at the end, and he'll be asking them to me. And so if you're watching on Zoom, there's the QA box for that. If you're on YouTube, there's the chat, and Daniel will be monitoring both of those. And we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of my presentation. And so let's begin. Here. So I'm sharing with you my story. And so I'd like to start by talking to you a little bit about today, about my family. And so I'd like to introduce you to, this thing's going to work. There's always something. There we go. that is me with my wife, Robin. And if you're wondering where that is, that was taken in September 2019 in the Judean Hills. We were attending a wedding of some close friends of ours. And I love that photo. And so I'm going to introduce you to my family in a particular way, as you're going to see in a second. I didn't think it was appropriate to tell all about them, that they each have their own stories, but I'm going to share with you a present that was given to us by Daniel's wife, Alexandra. Those who've been taking the course met her a couple of weeks ago when Daniel couldn't make it, and she was hosting on his behalf. And so this is the present that she gave to us for our 40th wedding anniversary, which was last year at this time, because our 41st anniversary is coming up on Monday. And so this is my family. And I thought I would just give you a general sense of who they are without getting into specifics. So Robin and I have 10 children. They're all our natural children. And they were all singles, no twins. Their ages range from 17 through 40. We have 6 girls and 4 boys. We have 4 in-laws. And as of today at 11:19 Eastern Daylight Time, our 7th grandchild was born, a girl, and mother and baby are fine, and another blessing, another miracle. So this is almost everybody. Last year, one, actually our 6th grandchild, another girl, was born a couple of months ago, and now the new one today. And so we've been very, very blessed. And when I look at this, I am still overwhelmed. And not just because there's a lot of them, but because there's something about this miracle that, how do I say, I got a little distracted for a second. Start again. When you get an idea of what my own family background is like and what I went through in my years growing up, you're going to know how much greater a miracle this than you might be imagining at this point. And so I'm going to turn off the share for a moment here. And so let me share a little bit about my own background. Okay, so where do I go from here? So both Robin and I grew up in the city of Montreal. All of our grandparents came from Eastern Europe. Most of them came from that came around the 1920s, that sort of time. All of our grandparents were Jewish. Basically the background is similar to the film Fiddler on the Roof without all the singing. And so I'm going to bring the share back up again. I'm just a little bit lost here. I'm going to get my bearings. All right. So both Robin and I grew up in the city of Montreal. She actually moved there when she was 4. I was born there. Montreal is a very special city. We currently live in Ottawa, which is 2 hours to the west. Montreal at the time was Canada's largest city. It's the world's 2nd largest French-speaking city. But we grew up in an English part of the town. Now, the Jewish community and one of the things I'm wondering is why I'm monitoring the Zoom, and I'm not too sure why my video is not coming up. Those of you on YouTube, I think, are seeing it. I'm just going to have to continue. So when Jewish people immigrated from Europe in the early part of the 1900s, and many came to Montreal, many others went to Toronto, but Montreal was the largest Canadian Jewish community for a long, long time. And in those days, the public schools were either Catholic or Protestant. And because we Jewish people were non-Catholics, the Catholic dominated society had our people all go to the Protestant schools. And the Protestant schools were English. There were French and English schools in the Catholic board, but only English schools in the Protestant board, and that's why most Jewish Montrealers were associated with English. Of course, we didn't have English coming over from Europe. And so while there are many French-speaking Jewish people, especially today in Montreal, like when I was a teenager, there was immigrations of French-speaking Jewish people, but the community had been mainly established by earlier and ended up becoming predominantly an English-speaking community. Now, there's something about Quebec and about Montreal that helped to make the Jewish community of Montreal kind of special, and that is especially in those days, the Catholic-dominated culture of Quebec didn't allow integration by other communities and cultures. And so even today in Montreal, there's very defined cultural neighborhoods. And so, especially for religious Jewish people, this was being in Montreal was appreciated because it was easier to have a very strong Jewish religious life. But that doesn't mean that the entire Jewish community was religious. So I come from a family that we respected the Jewish religion. We celebrated the holidays. I had a bar mitzvah when I was 13, but the Jewish religion didn't play a part in our day-to-day life. For very religious Jewish people, it does. And then, of course, you have all sorts of people that the various ways they relate to the Jewish religion and Jewish culture. But apart from religious observance, the Jewish community of Montreal had a very strong self-identity. And for me, growing up in the various neighborhoods that we lived in, these neighborhoods were very predominantly Jewish. So I went to a public school, public elementary, public high schools, and these schools were 90-something% Jewish. So when there was a Jewish holiday, there was almost nobody at the school. And this is just the environment that I lived in. Almost everybody that I knew, almost every child that I played with were Jewish. And we didn't really think much about it. This is just the life that we lived. So Montreal is known as the city that has a mountain in the center of it. We called it a mountain. It's actually a large hill. You can see it there in that photo. This is a scene from Montreal, from on top of Mount Royal, one of the iconic views of the city. Now, one of the things that we do when we have new friends coming to our house is we get out this old photo album and we like to show them this picture. So this is a picture of when both me and my wife, Robin, were in a Yiddish school. It's called Parrot School. By this time, I'd moved to Côte Saint Luc. I'm about 8 years old, 9 years old here in this photo. I was 2 years ahead of Robin in public school. We actually also went to the same public school. But then Jewish families would send their kids many of them would send their kids either to Hebrew school or to public school, Hebrew school or to Yiddish school. And our parents sent us to this Yiddish school. We learned a little bit of Hebrew, but it was mainly Yiddish, the language spoken by our parents and grandparents coming from Eastern Europe. And so this is a Hanukkah play that we did. Robin and I were in the same class. And if you were at our house, we would ask you to pick us out, which is difficult to do through this format. And so here we are. It's really something to think that those two little kids would one day be married and have the big family that we have. So I like to go on and share with you a little bit more about my personal background. And so I grew up in Montreal, as I was saying. I'm the youngest of 4 boys, much youngest. My next brother up is 8 years older than 12 years older than me, and 12, and then 14 years older than me. And so I was very much the younger. I was told that when I was 6 months old, I almost died of the croup. And that seemed to affect somewhat the way that I was brought up and the way that my mother would worry about me all the time. But my main memory of home life was the yelling and screaming, the constant conflict that was between my parents. And so that was really, really hard on me. There's some memories, of course, from the earlier part of my life that I don't remember, but I do remember that I was about 5 years old when I first went to a psychiatrist. And so I was in therapy at a pretty young age. I don't know why they sent me. Hopefully that had a good reason. When I was 8, my parents split up for the first time. My 2 older brothers, the 2 eldest ones, had both moved away to England. They were each there for about 6 years. And so my other brother went with my father, and my mother took me, and we moved to this part of Montreal called Côte Saint-Luc. For those of you that know Montreal, I was first born into the Côte-des-Neiges area, and then for most of elementary school into high school lived in Côte Saint-Luc. And so I was actually thinking about this in particular this week, and talking to the brother that went with my father, and it was quite a time taken away from my father and my brother for reasons I really didn't know why, and living on our own. In those days, I didn't know any other kids that were in broken homes. And so anyway, this was the summer before I went to grade 3. And a year later, my parents reconciled. I remember being really happy about that. And so my father moved in, and then life went on. Eventually, when I was 11 years old, I started not feeling good. I would complain about feeling nauseous. And I missed a few weeks of grade 6, went through some tests. They didn't see anything wrong, and eventually got over that time period. And then the beginning of the summer, this is the summer of 1969, parents and I went on a little trip to Toronto. That's something that we rarely did. My father really didn't like taking long trips, a 5.5 hour drive to Toronto. And on that trip, I remember my parents were bickering a lot, and I started not feeling well like I had been a month or 2 before. And it got worse and worse. And I was just not feeling well. I feel nauseous. And my mother was worried about me. My father was agitated. And we came back from Toronto, and I felt worse and worse. And eventually, I stopped eating entirely. I stopped drinking, and I stopped going to the bathroom. I went down to 57 pounds, and they took me to the hospital. All my life, I was told that it was a nervous breakdown. I don't know if that was the best way to describe it. It certainly was some sort of emotional breakdown. So that was July of 1969. I was in the hospital under observation for 3 weeks. So when Neil Armstrong was walking on the moon, I was in the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. They again did every test they could think of, and they didn't find anything physically wrong. Not surprised. And it's interesting. I remember to this day, and it's funny for me to think of as 8 and then as 11, how young I was when all these things were happening. And I remember it was very traumatic being in the hospital. But at the same time, I remember as soon as we got there, I felt better, and it was pretty obvious that it was my way of getting out of a house that was so full of antagonism and anger between my parents. And it probably wasn't all the time, but it felt like it was all the time. And being the youngest, what was I going to do with what I was feeling and what I was experiencing. And so survived the hospital, got out after 3 weeks, and kind of got better, I guess. And so the years went by, and in high school, and then when I was 15, I remember I was playing outside with a friend, and my father comes out with a suitcase, and he was leaving. I didn't see it coming. They had an altercation. My father decided to leave, and that led to their final divorce. Still, life went on. It was just, by that time, it was just me and my mother at home. My other brother, who I mentioned, he too had moved out, and it was just the two of us. And life went on. At one point, my mother's dream was to move to Florida. And I didn't want to go. And one of the reasons why I didn't want to go, there was my friends, but there was also my father. And then I had some sort of argument with my father, and I got the impression he didn't want to see me anymore. And so I told my mother I'd be fine to go to Florida with her. And so we really shouldn't have done this. We didn't do it the legal way. I guess we're not alone in that, right? So we sold everything, packed up the car, and drove. It was right in the middle of Watergate. It was 72, 73 is when we were there. And we lasted about 6 months. She claimed that we came back because of me, because I was miserable down there, didn't have any friends, this sort of thing. Lasted 6 months. One of the things that time did, and there was nice things about being in Florida during the winter, and some of the experiences that we had, but it ended up disrupting some of my school, which actually will affect how some of my story works out. Anyway, so we come back, and I start grade 11, and because of Florida and some of that, I needed to do a few more courses. So I ended up doing grade 11 for a second time. And for those of you who know Montreal, this was Wager High School that I had gone to. And that second year gave me a whole new set of friends. And that whole new set of friends play a part in what's going to happen. So I graduate high school, and in Quebec, we have a free community college called CEGEP. And so I go do my first year of CEGEP. And then it's late spring, school is over, and a friend of mine wanted to go visit a cousin of his in near New York City. And so we went down by bus. And the first morning we were there, we sat down to have breakfast. And that's when I had my first panic attack. I'd never experienced anything like that before. It was like butterflies in my stomach gone wild, and I couldn't stop it. And I started freaking out. And so I ran back to the hotel room and don't know what we're going to do. Got a doctor. He prescribed something. We ended up flying home that same day. And my eldest brother was a behavioral therapist, and he got one of his associates to start doing relaxation exercises with me. And I was due to work at a sleepaway camp for the first time that summer. It's now 1976. And somehow I was able to get it together enough, go to camp for 2 months, survived that experience, came home, and almost immediately the panic attacks started again. And they wouldn't, when I said, and I had them every day for about 2 weeks, nonstop having these panic attacks. And I was really becoming unglued. I didn't know what to do with myself. And I remember it was a particular Wednesday, early September. It must have been September the 1st. And I'm sitting on my bed, and I was actually pulling on my hair. And if you saw the photo at the beginning, the slide where I had hair, 1970s hair, pulling on my hair, and I was banging the mattress, and I was saying, what am I going to do? I'd become terrified of dying. I'd become scared of my own shadow. I used to take these walks to go visit friends in a very, very lovely, safe neighborhood. I remember being afraid, and I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. I'd become superstitious. I ended up with this routine. It's a little embarrassing to talk about now, where I would, just before I go to sleep every night, I would recite all these various things, bad things that hadn't happened to me yet. Like I haven't died, there's a good one, and various illnesses that I would name. I would list them, and I can't remember how it all went right now, but I would say these, this didn't happen to me, knock wood. This thing didn't happen to me, knock wood. I did that every night. And I also developed, I don't know if it was a physical dependency or emotional dependency, and I've actually given this more thought in more recent years, but back when I was about 14, 15, I was having trouble sleeping, and I went to see our family doctor, and he prescribed me with about a couple of weeks supply of 5 milligrams of Valium. And so that was supposed to help me sleep. I don't remember if it worked, but I took the dosage. And as it turned out, my mother had a whole stash of pills. I don't know how she got hold of all the pills that she had, but she had this drawer, and she had this unending supply of Valium. And so for the next several years, almost every night, I would take my 5 milligrams of Valium. I don't know if it was doing anything to me anymore, but it became one of those things. I was too scared to stop, because then I wouldn't be able to sleep. And I was raised with this thing: if I don't sleep, I'm going to die. If I don't eat, because I was always so skinny. I put on some weight from the 57 pounds when I was 11, but I was really skinny. And yeah, and I was just scared of so much. And now I'm having these panic attacks, and I really didn't know what to do with myself. And so there's around that time, I'm out of high school, but I had a high school friend who had a cousin who I'd met that summer, and we kind of hit it off, this guy, male cousin. And he was from Vancouver, and he was heading back. And I remember the day before, like it was Friday morning, September the 3rd, it's 1976. And I said goodbye to him. And for some reason, I thought, hey, I know he's going to the airport later on this afternoon. Maybe I'll go and see if he wants to hang out. So I called him up, and yeah, I could go over to his cousin's house. We'll just hang out until he leaves. Well, I had no idea what was going to happen that day. And so I go to his house in Côte Saint Luc, and the cousin's house, to visit the cousin, my friends, you know what I mean. And so we're there, and eventually these two high school friends that I hadn't seen in a while, they were twins, they came over, and I had heard that one of them had a boyfriend from California. His name was John. Heard about him, never met him. Well, he was visiting from California, and the twins, the boyfriend, and their dog all walk into the house. And eventually I find myself alone in the living room with John, and I guess I need to make some conversation. So I said to him, what do you do or want to do, but can't because you don't have enough money? We were both, I was turning 19, he was about 18. And so I asked, just trying to make some small talk, and he said to me, I preach the word of the Lord. He may not have sounded so somber, but that's what he said. And that was the strangest thing I had ever heard. And I always forget, I have to tell people who aren't familiar with the environment I grew up in, everybody's Jewish. And so John's Jewish, and never, like, this, Jewish people don't talk like this. And I don't know why, to this day, I don't know why I kept this crazy conversation going, and we continue talking. And so to help a little bit, I'm going to bring back my PowerPoint here. And as we got talking, John said that he believed these three things. The first thing was that the Bible is the word of God. The second is that God had a son. And the third, Jesus is the Messiah. Well, I had a bar mitzvah. We weren't religious. I'd never read the Bible before. I was more interested in TV shows and music and girls. And yet what I knew was I didn't believe any of these three things. So my three objections to his three propositions were, first of all, as far as I was concerned, God can't write a book. Like, that was crazy to have somebody say that to me. Now, also during this time period, There were hot in the news were cults. Remember Jonestown and the Moonies, and also it was just 3 years after Watergate, and the idea of cover up and conspiracy, and so as you know, I was saying to John, like, you know, how do you know that there hasn't been some sort of cover up and changes and all sorts of things, you know, in all the years, you know, from when the Bible first existed. I also was certain God can't have a son, and that's very deeply ingrained into our Jewish psyche. You know, it's easy to say, "Oh, God can do anything," but this very Christian idea is anathema to the Jewish mind. And so the thing is, I didn't even know if I believed there was a God, because God simply was not on my radar at all. He was completely irrelevant to my life. So I don't know if I was an atheist, an agnostic. I was like I don't care. It didn't mean anything. But I knew that he can't have a son. And if there's such a thing as a Messiah, and I didn't know a lot about this Messiah concept. I knew that there was this traditional expectation of a great deliverer who will come to save the day, so to speak. But I knew one thing: it wasn't Jesus. And so John proceeded to explain why he believed that the Bible was the word of God, that Jesus is the Son of God and the Messiah. And the first thing that he explained to me was this, and some of you who've been in my class have talked about this before. So this is what used to be the oldest manuscript of the Jewish Bible, what's often called the Old Testament, and it's from the 900s, the 10th century AD. So this is a page from what's called the Aleppo Codex, and up until 1947, this was the oldest copy of the Old Testament, which means from whenever these writings were originally written. So it's possible the Jewish Bible was completed around 450 before Jesus came. So between that time and the year like 900-ish, that's a long time to have no copies. So how would we know that this copy represents something that's accurate? So this is all new to me. John's explaining this to me. And then he says, one of the reasons why we can know that the copies of the Bible are accurate is because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the south of Israel near the Dead Sea, Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the area called Qumran. There are many caves in this area. There was these people called the Essenes, who had left Jerusalem and settled in this very barren area. And in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a rock into one of these caves and heard a sound and discovered these large clay jars. And through a miracle, the scrolls that were in these jars got into the right hands, and it was discovered that among them, there were all sorts of different writings, but there were also copies of the Jewish Bible. And in fact, and some of you already know this, and it's kind of neat. So John, 18 years old, is telling me all about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And a few years ago, the curator of the Shrine of the Book at the Jerusalem Museum in Israel came to Ottawa to do a lecture. And now the expert is explaining the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he was saying all the same things that 18-year-old John was telling me on that day. And so among them, there's the entire book of Isaiah and many other biblical manuscripts. And when they're dated, and there's been some, just lately, there's been some further dating done and seeing that some of the scrolls are even older than originally thought. But we know that at least there are scrolls, biblical scrolls from 165 BC. So that's the 2nd century BC. So up until that time, we had manuscripts that were, 1,400 years at least after the fact, if not more. And now we have manuscripts that are only a couple of hundred years from when the writings were. And as John said to me, when they compared the manuscripts, now were Dead Sea Scrolls, 2nd century BC, Aleppo Codex, 10th century, 1100, 1200 years gap, they almost identically matched. And so John said to me, man can't do that. Only God can. And he explained how, and when we know human beings are actually not very good at passing on information. You know, the game Broken Telephone, you sit in a circle and you whisper a word or phrase into someone's ear, and it doesn't take too long before it gets totally messed up. And this is true with ancient manuscripts. It has the same problem. And so it's incredible that the biblical manuscripts could be so well preserved. Didn't convince me, but it did impress me. The second question, can God have a son? And so now he wanted to show me some things in the Bible. And I said, only the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. I don't want to see anything from the New Testament. Remember, I wasn't religious. I wasn't very familiar with the Bible, but I knew that the New Testament was taboo. In fact, back when my mother and I moved to Florida, I can't remember if it was on the way there, on the way back. At some point, I was in the motel room by myself and opened the drawer. There was a Gideon Bible, and I'd never read the Bible before. I just wanted to look at it. And so I picked it up. It didn't have a leather cover like this one, but I made sure to open it near the beginning, lest my eyes would see the writings of the forbidden book. It sounds a little funny, but it was serious. This was not for me. I knew I was to have nothing to do with the New Testament. So John assured me he would only show me things from the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament. He took me to the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where it says, then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And John said, see, it says our, it doesn't say my image. Now, there are various scriptures I'm going to share with you that are a little more complicated than maybe what John shared with me that day, but I've been working on this for almost 45 years. I've dealt with a lot of objections, a lot of concern, my own issues, and these things hold up. And while this may not be a way to say that this proves Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the way you hear in the New Testament and in Christianity, it's interesting that this language would be here at all, because in Jewish thinking, and even for non-religious Jews like myself, it's so impressed upon us that God is a singularity. He's a singularity. The way we understand that he's one is in this, as if he's a unit, as opposed to a complex unity, which actually seems to be what the Bible teaches and what this likely is reflecting. And so just seeing this kind of wording in contrast to what I've always been led to believe was striking. Then we went to 2 Samuel chapter 7, and particularly verse 14. This is God's promise to David about the dynasty that he's going to build for David and about the son that he's going to have. Primarily, it's talking about Solomon, but when you read the passage, there's more than just Solomon going on here. And here's this terminology that again surprised me. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And again, it was difficult to reckon with the fact that Judaism is so anti this kind of language, and yet it's in our Bible. Psalm 2, verses 1 and 2, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against his anointed. The Hebrew there, anointed, that's Mashiach or Messiah. And then when we get to the end of the Psalm, verse 12, it says, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. And again, what's this doing here? Then he took me to the book of Proverbs, near the end of the book of Proverbs, and he takes me to this passage. And again, those of you on Zoom, if you're not seeing my video, I'm not sure why. Maybe you are on the screen I have here. I'm not, but anyway, I'll continue. I keep being told stop apologizing, so I'm sorry about that. So here he opened up the book of Proverbs to this verse and put his hand over the bottom of the paragraph or the stanza. And he reads it. It says, who has ascended to heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in his fists? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? John turns to me and asks me, who? I'm not stupid. I know the answer. It's God. Then he reads the last bit. What is his name and what is his son's name? Surely you know. Jaw drop. What's going on here? How come I've never seen anything like this before? What's going on? All right. Then is the question, is Jesus the Messiah? And so we're going to go over various ones of the prophecies. As we look at messianic prophecies like this, I explained in the course how the words of the prophets, and when they speak, thus says the Lord, the intent of their message is what we call forthtelling. It's them calling the people back to God. In the time of the prophets, the people of Israel had, for the most part, had gone astray. They had turned to idols. We know from the Torah, the books of Moses, that if that should happen, the people should expect a great judgment. God's very patient. And through the years, through the centuries, he started sending the prophets with these warnings, basically with the message, shape up or ship out. You will be exiled from the land and foreigners will rule over you if you don't listen. But it was all turn back to God, turn back to his word. So the main intent in the prophets is forthtelling, but intermingled or intertwined within the forthtelling is some foretelling, where they speak about the future, that where judgment is coming, various things are going to happen. You're going to be overridden. You're going to go into exile. And in the midst of, John didn't explain all this to me. He just went right to the prophecies, but I'm almost done this little introduction. So in the midst of these predictions, it begins to unfold a picture of a great deliverer who becomes known as the Messiah, the great anointed one, originally as promised to David. Now some of the details about him are beginning to emerge through the centuries, through the prophets. And so here we go. So John continued on. I believe these are the ones that he shared with me. I might have snuck in an extra one. I might be leaving one out, but you get the picture. Okay, he would be a king from the ancient or eternal past. This is Micah chapter 5, verse 2 to verse 5. In English translations published by Jewish publishers, it's verse 1 instead of verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, I should tell you this. I'm going to embarrass myself a little bit. Before he read this passage, he said, "Where was Jesus born?" And I couldn't remember. Grew up in Catholic Montreal. We all knew Christmas carols. I'd seen Christmas movies, and let's say I went blank, because remember, I was having these panic attacks, so maybe I wasn't myself. All right. And by the way, I was having the panic attacks every day, but most of the time I could still show well when I was with other people. I've been pretty good with that my whole life, actually. Okay. So then this passage says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who's in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace." So this king from ancient times, possibly from eternity, would emerge from Bethlehem. He would also be a divine child king. "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." So there's going to be this child given, interesting language, whose name is called Mighty God, Everlasting Father. Really? He'd also be born of a virgin. Isaiah 7, verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. Now, there's a bit of controversy here. The Hebrew for virgin is alma. But alma isn't the technical term for virgin, but it does mean a woman of marriageable age, a young woman of marital age, usually single. And so there's something unusual going on here. And so an ancient translation used the term virgin, which is appropriate. Then a prophecy from Daniel chapter 9, verses 25 to 26. I'm going to be reading it in the New American Standard Bible. And this talks about the time of his coming. I remember that John shared this with me, and I remember that I didn't understand anything that he tried to explain, but I'll read it to you. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, which is a way of talking about he'll be killed. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. So in Jewish thought, the Messiah is supposed to come and usher in peace, the end of the age, it's called, the resurrection of the dead, and all evil and sickness and everything will be eradicated. That's what everyone is always told. But according to Daniel 9, the Messiah was going to come, he was going to be cut off, and then the city and the sanctuary was going to be destroyed. Well, that had happened before the time of Daniel. Daniel was living in the Babylonian exile, which eventually became Persia. So the temple had been destroyed. This gives the impression that it was going to be rebuilt and destroyed again, with the Messiah having to come before the destruction of the second temple, which happened in 70 AD. John must have explained all that to me. I didn't understand at the time, but I get it now. He'd be rejected. This is not a messianic prophecy. I've already read some Psalms, but there are prophetic portions in the Psalms. So Psalm 118, verses 22 to 23, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. So this idea that Messiah would be rejected is also like it's not considered in the Jewish world, but it's strongly suggested by the Old Testament, and we'll be seeing that more in a moment. He'd be pierced. Zechariah 12, verse 10. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, very interesting, look upon God, but on him whom they've pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. He be crucified. Psalm 22, verses 16 to 18. For dogs encompass me. Now, David is talking, but his language goes way beyond his own experience. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. And those of you familiar with the gospel stories, all these things happened to Jesus. It was all new to me because I knew next to nothing about Jesus. John was telling me these things happened to him, as including this one, entering Jerusalem on a donkey, Zechariah 9, verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. This is exactly what Jesus did. And interestingly, there have been people that have theorized that Jesus actually plotted all this. There's actually a book called The Passover Plot that says that he set this all up. And interestingly, in the Gospels, he does set this up, but he could not have set up all the other things like the Roman soldiers casting lots for his garments. So this brings us to the passage that was the most impactful of them all. And this is Isaiah 53. It was written about 650 years before Jesus came. And this, of course, I didn't know this until John told me. It turns out, thankfully, he was right. And it's a remarkable play-by-play of what Jesus went through. Now, remember, I'd never seen this before. I'd never seen any of these other passages before. And so this is the big one. And what I'd like to do at this time is bring on a special guest and invite him here to join me, who's going to read Isaiah 53 for us. I trust that he can hear me and start his camera, because I'd like to introduce, this is John Pelzer. This is the John who I met September the 3rd, 76, who shared all these things with me. It must be very strange for him to be overhearing me say his name over and over again. And John said this and John said that. And I'm going to talk more about him as we go along here. Just a little bit before we go over to him. So I first met John that day, and he was around in Montreal for a few more weeks after that. Then he left. We stayed in contact a little bit, but eventually we fell out of contact. And we recontacted because I was telling this same story at a group that Daniel, who you saw at the beginning, was leading at our parliament. There was a Friday noon hour study every week, and I got to speak there sometimes. And Daniel wanted me to share my story. And so I talked about John, and it was question time, like we'll have at the end of the session. And one of the people very near the beginning said, "Whatever happened to John?" And so I don't know. So I went onto Facebook, I found him, connected with him. We had a phone call. And then just a few years ago, my wife and I were down at Coney Island, Brooklyn, to watch Team Israel win a World Baseball Classic qualifier. And John and his wife were living not far from there. We had dinner together. It was the first time my wife met him, first time I saw him in 40 years. And for those of you that, some of my kids might be watching this, seeing John for the very first time. And so welcome, John.
Thank you, Alan. I wish I had a fraction of your memory.
Well, this is a story I cannot forget.
That was a great presentation, and it's very heartfelt and a wonderful testimonial. Thank you for sharing it.
So how are you and your family doing in these COVID days?
We're doing well. Nobody in our family contracted COVID, and everyone is well. And we've been a little bit too careful, which is okay. So we're healthy and inoculated. So everything's good.
And you live in that kind of country within a country, right?
Oh, Texas. Yeah, I live in Dallas. And it's a little crazy here, And but it doesn't live up to its stereotype. People here are fantastic and really warm and spirit-filled. I've had nothing but great experiences with the people in Dallas.
That's wonderful. Well, I've already thanked you many times for your willingness to do this. I thank you again. And so I'm going to bring up the passage, and John's going to read Isaiah 53 for us. So as soon as you're ready.
Sure. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors.
Thank you, John, so much.
Pleasure.
I'm so glad you're able to do this with us today. So every blessing to you and your family.
To you as well.
Thank you. There's so much in that passage. It was brand new to me. John, when he was reading it, would do commentary about how Jesus was treated, and how he suffered, and the fact things like dying with the wicked, in that he was crucified among thieves, but buried with the rich. He was put in a rich man's tomb. And there's so many other things that we can unpack. I would learn later on some of the objections to that passage, the main one being the most popular way it's thought of in the Jewish world today, is that the suffering servant is Israel. And one of the reasons for saying that is in Isaiah chapter 40, Isaiah 40 through 66, there's this whole servant motif, we call it, a theme of the servant. And sometimes it is Israel, but here it appears to be an individual. And one of the things that shows that is that this individual is suffering on the behalf of Isaiah's people. So it can't be the people of Israel if these are suffering on his people's behalf. Anyway, look at it. You can look at it closer another time. Anyway, this was breathtaking. I was really, really impressed. And so, done looking at the scriptures, and John asked me this question: why did Jesus come? Now, I didn't know that much about Jesus, but I had seen Jesus Christ Superstar twice that past summer. And I really thought I was smart, and I used big words. I said he was a civil disobedient, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi, that sort of idea. And he said, no, Jesus came to die. I'd never heard that before. And he explained about how the sacrifices worked. And he referred particularly to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, this special sacrifice that would be done for the sins of the people. But those sacrifices were done year after year after year. They didn't solve the sin problem. And so then he said, he also mentioned, he defined sin for me. He said, sin is when you break a commandment of God, and people who break his commandments are sinners. I'd also never heard that before. And so he said, Jesus, I call him now, I prefer to call him Yeshua, but we were using that anglicized way of speaking about him at the time. And he said that Jesus was the final sacrifice to provide forgiveness for our sins. And he said that if I would believe in him, confess my sins, say I'm sorry for my sins, and believe in him, then John said I would be happy for the rest of my life and live forever in heaven. Now, I didn't care about heaven. John didn't know what I'd been going through. Remember, I could hide it well, how miserable I was. And all of a sudden, I'm being offered happiness forever. Well, I thought that was crazy. And I asked him, are you happy all the time? And he said, yes. It still sounded more crazy, but we kept on talking. And so we kept on, and he wanted me to say this prayer. And I'm looking at what he's doing. I remember he had this black bag, and he had these pamphlets in it, and Bibles and books. And he was really fanatical about what he was doing, obviously. And so I said to him, if I believe this, will I have to become like you? And he said, no, God won't make you do anything you don't want to do. Now, of course, we often have to go against how we feel to do what is right. That's not what John was talking about. Remember, this was a time of the cults, the Moonies and the others. And what he was saying was, you're not joining this organization, and we're not going to make you do things. No one's going to make you do anything. It's totally going to be up to you. And I said, okay, fine. But then I realized how radical this was. And I thought, I said to him, what happens if I believe this and I lose some of my friends? And he said, well, if that happens, they weren't your friends in the first place. And I thought, oh, that makes sense. There's a girl I was interested in at the time. She was my girlfriend or anything. And remember, almost everybody I know is Jewish. And he said, if I believe this, she may not want to go out with me. John said, if that happens, she's not the one for you. And talk about prophecy. Obviously, she wasn't. She would hang up on me eventually when I was trying to tell her about this experience, what I'm telling you now. And of course, we know who it was that God wanted me to marry. I just didn't know that. I didn't know that little Robin in that picture was going to be my wife. Honest, I didn't. So we went on, and he explained to me that if I say this prayer that he'd share with me, God would show me signs. And I thought, signs? Now, you might know in the New Testament, it talks about Jews long for signs. Well, there's a good reason for that, because we're the people that, even though many Jewish people don't think that God does miracles anymore, but we know if God is really God, then he does stuff. And John was telling me that if I took this step, then I wouldn't have to convince myself. God would prove himself to me. I thought, well, I could handle that. So I realized I had everything to gain and I had nothing to lose. And he shared at that time in such a way, just say this prayer and watch what happens. Now, I wouldn't offer that to anyone today. And, John was young and he was passionate for this. And of all the things that he shared with me that day, you don't really have to believe is just say these words, whether that's what he intended. That's what I believe I heard. While I was being offered it that way, there's a couple of things that really, really happened. The first one is I saw Yeshua in my Bible, in the Jewish Bible. I was profoundly impacted by what I saw. The second thing is I call this my heart miracle. Of course, at the time, I didn't understand what was going on. But what happened was when John explained to me what sin was, breaking commandments is sin, people who sin are sinners, I thought, okay, I can accept that. That was a huge miracle, especially in the sense that I could admit that I'm a sinner. Well, John didn't know that I had become so wrapped up in myself. I had developed my almost 19-year-old philosophy that I had decided that I was never going to say I was sorry to anybody ever again. And I had it all worked out. I figured if I did something that I didn't mean to do, I didn't have to say I was sorry. And if I did something I did mean to do, then I was not going to say I was sorry. That's where I was at. I was so self-obsessed. And this guy's telling me I'm a sinner. And I'm thinking, okay, sure, I can accept that. And so by that time, the cousin that was going back to Vancouver was gone, and the friend gone. In fact, everybody who lived in that house was gone. It was me, the twin sisters, John, and the dog. And we got in a circle, and not a weird circle. We got together, and John led in this prayer that he would pray, and I would repeat. That was along the lines of, "Dear God, forgive me, for I have sinned against you. Forgive me for my sins. Thank you that you sent your son, Jesus, into the world to forgive my sins. And I believe in him and ask him into my heart and life." And it was a little more complicated than that. I remember being impressed by how he led. I remember telling him how beautiful I thought the prayer was. And we're getting ready to go. And he says, I'll call you. And I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. Remember, you said to me, I won't have to do anything I don't want to do. Don't call me, I'll call you. And I left. I went to a rock concert that night. For those of you from Montreal, I was at Place des Nations, the expo site, and saw ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. It was a wonderful concert. And that was it. Went out with a bunch of friends that night, tried to tell my best friend about what happened to me. He really wasn't getting it. But I'd left that feeling that I'd been let in on talk about conspiracy. It was like, there's this cover up. How come me and anybody I know, none of my friends, Jewish friends, knew about this? And I was really excited to talk about it. Anyway, the next morning I get up, remember, it's just me and my mother at home. And I was having these panic attacks, and I was blaming my mother for all of my issues and all my problems. And she didn't know that I was trying to find a way to move out. In fact, my eldest brother was living in the city at that time and gave me a key to his apartment so that I could go there whenever I wanted to stay around my mother as little as possible. So I said, I got up in the morning and I went over to her and I said, Ma, I have something I want to tell you. And she said, you're moving out. I'm thinking, how did she know that? Mothers. And remember, it wasn't even 24 hours since I said this prayer. And remember all the stuff I'd been going through. And I said to her, no, I don't think I have to now. And I proceeded to tell her what happened with John the day before. She listened patiently. There's things that made her a little uncomfortable. She kind of held it together. But I didn't know. I freaked her out completely. She thought I had joined the Jesus freaks, gotten in the clutches of a cult. And she was really concerned because she also knew how emotionally troubled I was. And so she did what any good Jewish mother would do. And she called a local rabbi. And I wish I could talk to that man and find out what really happened from his point of view. All I know is from my mother later on, what she was told. And so she explained to him where I was at and what I had done. And for some reason, this rabbi said to my mother, let him do it. I figure, based on my mother's description, he was concerned that she might push me away and lose me forever, sort of thing, and probably thought, oh, it's just a fad. He will grow out of it. Well, I was on cloud 9. Well, actually, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit. I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible. And so anyway, it was a Saturday, and that night I went to a party. It was at the house of the girl I was interested in. And I have this memory of sitting on their basement stairs and thinking to myself, it's now the nighttime. And I'm thinking, this is the first time I haven't had a panic attack in 24 hours. And I was, whoa, what just happened? And I forgot to tell you something. The night before, when I went to bed that night, remember, I knew next to nothing. This was all new to me. And I was just kind of trying it to see if it was real. I was waiting for God to give me these signs. But I thought, if I'm going to take this serious at all, I can't do this knock wood thing anymore. So I stopped. And I can't take the Valium anymore. I knew I was dependent upon it. And I stopped. I didn't know how dangerous it was, even with 5 milligrams of Valium, to stop cold turkey. But I had no effects from that at all, to the point the panic attacks themselves completely stopped. And so the Saturday night, no panic attacks. And now I'm on cloud 9. Something is happening here. And then there were these little things that were happening, call them coincidences, call them signs, that were impressing upon me, something's going on. And while I was getting ready to call John, finally, after about 2 weeks, he called me, we got together and began to, explain to me how to read the Bible, how to pray every day. And he got me going in the faith. And so I was telling all my friends about what had happened to me. I was so excited. I would drag them to see John, and he would explain. Remember, these are all Jewish friends, just about, and he would explain the same presentation, explained to me. And I remember during this time, I was talking to all my friends on the phone. Very few young people had their own phone. We were actually on welfare at the time. And I didn't mention about how money and was just the thing that caused so much grief between my parents. And so we were in a really bad state financially, but somehow my mother figured out how to get me my own phone line. And I'd be talking to my friends about this new faith that I had, and was really bothering her. And at some point, she said to me, if you become a Christian, you can pack your bags. Well, John's explanation of the faith was completely in a Jewish context. He explained to me I was a completed Jew. He mentioned that in Hebrew, Jesus was Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. I saw everything from the Old Testament. He was Jewish, his girlfriend's Jewish. Her twin sister also came to faith the day before I did. It was all Jewish. And so to me, it wasn't a Christian thing. And then some weeks later, I was with John where he was staying, and he referred to himself as a Christian. And I thought to myself, ooh, I better not tell my mother. And we could discuss how appropriate the term Christian is for Jewish believers. That's another story. I'm just telling you the stories as they happened. Anyway, my mother was really, really concerned about how I was so focused on this, but the change in my life was so great. 3 months later, my mother also came to believe. And there was nobody on the planet that knew what I was going through as much as she did. And she saw my life up close. And I was completely changed. And a year later, I ended up going to Bible school, Ontario Bible College. It's now called Tyndale University College in Toronto. Robin ended up coming there the following year. We had become friends after we both had become believers. These are long stories I won't get into. So we had met as friends. We were not friends before, even though we were in the same neighborhood and so on. Finding out that we're both believers in Yeshua was a great connection, of course. I didn't know that she was planning to go to the school that I went to when I went there a year before she did. You could play this back in the recording after to see if I said that correctly. And so we became better and better friends. We ended up being married 41 years ago, May the 10th, 1980, before our last year of school. And then our first child was born 10 days after graduation. I often get that timing wrong, but it's about 10 days. I think that's correct. And not knowing the big family that we would have. And from there, about 9 months later, we moved to Vancouver, and I was working in ministry for 6 years there. We came back to Montreal. We tried to start a messianic congregation. That's a Jewish-oriented congregation. 4 years in Montreal. That didn't actually go so well. We ended up going back to Vancouver. I went into high tech, and I did all sorts of computer type jobs, all the while our family's growing. And some of you have taken the Old Testament course, have heard some of my reflections about just the whole finances thing, because my father believed money made the world go round. And he proved that in how he would quibble and quarrel and argue with my mother, almost always about money. And I was raised with this thing about, we can't do this, we can't do that because we don't have the money. We don't have the money. And then eventually my mother and I end up on welfare. And so lack of money and fear. And now I'm reading the Bible, walking with God, trying to live by faith and discover that God's going to provide everything that I need. I just need to walk with him, obey him, follow his lead. For some of you, I don't know if I'm using lingo that you may not understand, and I'm confronted what the scripture says about, if I do what God wants, God will take care of my material needs. Robin believed the same thing. And so that's how we lived. And we got story after story about God's magnificent, miraculous, incredible means unbelievable, but unbelievable to us, the way God has provided through the years. I just want to comment on a couple more things, and then we'll go to to your questions. One of the fascinating things that happened to me that day was, besides the emotional aspect, which I'm going to give you some final comments on that in a moment, is how coming to believe in Jesus, Yeshua, the Messiah, what that meant to me as a Jewish person. And what really helped is that John's presentation was completely a Jewish one. I remember at the beginning, I forgot to mention, one of the first things he said, who wrote the New Testament, Jews or Gentiles? Gentiles, of course, it's Christianity, right? No, Jewish people, with the exception of maybe one author. It's all written by Jewish people. And a lot of Jewish people are so impressed when they finally read the New Testament and see how much of a Jewish book it actually is. Well, a lot of Jewish people, one of our main angst is identity. What does it really mean to be a Jewish person? I remember working at Jewish camp and having activities where on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, we would have special activities and discussions. And very common is, who is a Jew? What comprises a true Jewish person? Religion, what is it? And coming to believe in the Jewish Messiah resolved that for me, even though many Jewish people have rejected our belief in us, and it's caused conflict between us and family and friends. At the same time, I'm secure in who I am as a Jewish person. And that's something that God has developed more and more over time through the years, mainly through his word and also through our experience. And then that's something as a family we've had to work on through the years. What does it mean to have, a Jewish man, Jewish woman? We both believe in Yeshua as the Messiah. How are we going to raise our kids? And so the next thing is just about family. And I showed you the drawing that Alexandra did for us for our anniversary last year, and the blessing that our family is to us, and our family is to others. But the fact that we have an intact family at all, given, I'll just speak for myself, given my background and all the brokenness and my own personal instability, and it hasn't been easy. And I'm going to share about how it hasn't been easy for me. But, parenting isn't easy. Family isn't easy. And then to do what we've done in traveling back and forth across the country several times and having to rely on the Lord to provide and all the rest. So that when I see a picture like that, that's one of the reasons why it overwhelms me, given where I come from in the broken family, the fragmented family of my own background. Now, my final comments, I want to return to the emotional side of things. So it makes a good story to say, I said the prayer September the 3rd, 1976. The panic attack stopped, and I never had anxiety issues ever again. That it's a nice story, but it wouldn't be true. I went about 3 months without any real serious anxiety, which was amazing. And I appreciate that to this day. It would be years before I would find myself really having to confront some of those, call them old demons from my past. And it was, some of the difficulty with that is because my story had this foundation of said the prayer and then it was all good. And so then what do I do with the struggles? And as time would go by, and the times I've had no work, we've had no money, various struggles that we had, health issues, and so on, the great pressure. And the fact is, I was not perfected yet. And so I would run into aspects of myself that were troubling. And it would take years before I'd realize that some of the ways that I was relating to my wife, relating to my kids, was not healthy. I've struggled with anger, but I've also struggled with depression and sometimes even despair. But in its own way, and you're not, as believers, we're not supposed to talk about despair, but sometimes when I found myself metaphorically at the precipice, like staring into the dark, feeling like my life is over, like some of the biblical characters, feeling like my life is over, it got to the point where I would expect God to come through for me. I don't have time to go into some of the specific stories, but in that, it was so strange to sometimes be miserable, just kind of tied into knots, like just feeling like I'm sitting in the dark, and yet at the same time knowing my God is coming to rescue me. I don't know how, I don't know when, but he's going to do it. And he's done it every single time. And one of the greatest gifts of all this, and of course I can go on and on, is the whole concept of forgiveness that I was not raised with. And many of you might have similar stories. For most of my life, my father did not talk to his brother. My mother didn't talk to this cousin. And of course, if somebody else was in relationship with that cousin, then she couldn't have a relationship with them. And then that even happened in my immediate family, my mother and my brother, and the mess that created, and this heavy destructive bitterness. And the fact that I would be extended forgiveness by the Lord and saturate in it, in his word, and knowing like what the Messiah taught, if we don't forgive others their sins, our Father in heaven will not forgive ours. And I take that very, very seriously. And so I've even said one of the reasons why I think God gave me 10 kids is that I could hear, I forgive you, Daddy, over and over and over again, because I have really, really messed up. And yet there's forgiveness, there's restoration. And I'm so grateful that even in the ways that I may have hurt my wife, hurt my kids through ways that I've not behaved as I should have, that we've been able to work those things out. We've been able to see his forgiveness. And I continue, like whether it's something exciting, like I was really looking forward to tonight. Well, I was almost fit to be tied with, call it excitement, call it anxiety. And I find it really different. Then certain things happened, like our daughter goes into labor this morning, and thankfully everything went well. But the excitement, I start to get really, really, wound up. And that doesn't always go well for me. And some of you understand exactly what I'm talking about. And then I have to remember that I'm not perfect, and I'm a frail human being, and God loves me anyway, and he sees me through, and he forgives me. It's, when I talk this way, it's no excuse for the ways that I've yelled at my kids through the years and said things to them or to my wife that I shouldn't have. And thank God that they forgive me for some of the ways that I've spoken to them. And if there's anybody else out there I know from the past, if we haven't made amends, I would look forward to doing that, because there is a mine of treasure of God's goodness and his forgiveness and his restoration and his peace. Peace even in the midst of anxiety. Can you believe it? That such a thing is possible. These are some of my reflections. And we've gone on longer than I had thought we would. And so we're going to go to the questions. So I invite Daniel to come back. And I could see that at least on Zoom, not a lot of questions yet. Feel free to put in your questions now. And we normally end these sessions at the bottom of the hour, but because it's a special one, we'll take the questions, see what happens.
Thanks, Dad. Well, Dad, it must be so much energy poured into sharing your story from start to, I don't want to say start to finish, because your story is ongoing, but thank you, Dad, for sharing with us. And everybody who's tuned in, we have about 80 people watching live on Zoom, and about 40 people have tuned in on YouTube, and more will watch it afterward. And we're grateful for everyone who's taking their time to be with us. Dad, I have a quick question before we jump into other questions that might be coming in even now, which is, so we hear your story today, and there's some dramatic moments of being young and ending up in the hospital with a breakdown and taking Valium every day and certain stuff like that. John coming in and being able to open up the Bible for you, and you're giving your life to Yeshua right there. What about people listening and they're thinking, I've been around for some time, I don't really have a story to tell, and they might be intrigued by your story and maybe feeling a little empty inside about their lack of story? What might you say to them?
Well, I'm not saying this is what they're experiencing, because I haven't experienced what they've experienced. But are we, somebody comes forward and says, I was blind and I was healed. Like, what a great story. You could write a book about that, right? Or anything that's like that. But if you have been able to see your entire life, who's got the better story? So I hope that the story of my emotional trauma, and which I haven't explained too much, of my own journey since, of struggling with same but so different because it's been with the Lord, my hope is it will encourage people who have that similar kind of experience. But if you have grown up and you're an emotionally stable person, and you come from a family that's loving and has stayed together, and you don't share some of the issues that I have, like, in many ways, you've got the better story. So please don't just I'll call it what it is. Don't be jealous over somebody. People have had worse and more dramatic stories than me. And yeah, they get to write the books. And maybe some of them even become famous because of their great story. But if you didn't have grief and you loved God from an early age, and you come from generations that did, like, you have so much riches to what's the word, to help,
to mine, to harvest,
mine derive
give
from, and that's such a blessing to you and to others. And we all have to walk the paths that God leads us on. We're all very different. And another thing, for those of you that might feel bad that you don't have a story, I wonder if you have more of a story than you think you do. And some of your story might be what happened to your grandparents, your great-grandparents, but also for yourself. There might be a lot more to you than you really know. And if you can get your eyes off of looking at other people who you wish you were like and ask God, what about me? Be interesting to hear what he says to you.
Thanks, Dad. There's comments coming in, and not quite questions perhaps, but comments from Doug Trick and Marty Bell and many others. So that's just so grateful for everyone tuning in. Special to share the evening with you. There's a question from Roger from Sudbury. Roger says, when I hear testimonies like yours, a common theme may be ignorance of the Old Testament teaching and even a lack of knowledge. Is it because of a purposeful hiding of the truth in synagogue, or spiritual blindness, or both? Can you comment on this, Alan/Dad?
There's Jewish relationship to Jesus and the New Testament is a complex thing. In terms of the current generation, and I'll include myself among that if I may. So the people who are all Jewish people alive today, which I'm one of them, most of us were bred with a very negative view of Christianity. Story I didn't mention that I was planning to was about 5 or 6 years old. I loved toys, and I thought toys would make me happy. And these Christians had this holiday every year that was all about toys, because I watched TV and I knew about Christmas, and it was all about these presents that these kids would get. And of course and they were all on TV, the kids with the toys were all very happy, and I wanted to be like them. And so I remember it was winter, it must've been near Christmas time. I was looking out the window, living in the Côte-de-Neige area. And my mother was nearby, and I turned to her and I said, I wish we weren't Jewish so that we could celebrate Christmas. So my mother used that opportunity to as an educational moment. And she turned to me and said, if you ever say anything like that again, I will slap your face. Well, I got the message. They are them and we are us. So that's a big one. Now, of course, a lot of the reason for that is the negative things from the church to the Jewish world. And so the Jewish world has been persecuted and damaged, actually, very much by Christianity. And so there's just not much interest in pursuing those things that have anything to do with Christianity. Then getting to the knowledge of the Bible, most Jewish people don't read the Bible. Even among religious Jewish people, there's some familiarity with some parts of the Bible, like great familiarity with the first 5 books among very religious Jews, but not much understanding or knowledge of the prophetic works. And as you grow in your relationship to Judaism, you move towards other religious literature like the Talmud. And the Bible doesn't have the place in the Jewish world like it does in the Christian world. And then, by and large, Jewish people are just like other people anywhere, not interested in spiritual things, not interested in studying the Bible. So you don't know what you don't know.
Thanks, Dad. You don't know what you don't know is a powerful word. Matthew from Ottawa has a question. He says, what advice can you offer to people future husbands and fathers specifically, who have come from troubled families, who want to have meaningful and fruitful families of their own. Thank you so much.
Okay. So the first part is not a pat answer. Make God first in your life in every way possible. There's I believe it's in the Psalms. No one who believes in him, which is trust in him, will be disappointed. If we truly put our trust in the Lord. And one of the things that in my naivety and youth that really helped is I poured myself in to reading the Bible, praying, being with other believers, sharing my faith with other people. It was so central to my life and became my passion, because I was rescued from a dark pit. And so this became everything. And not that I wasn't interested in anything else at all, but it was so central to my life. And if I can say, like, if we really do business with God, he's not going to let us down. Now, along with that is we need to be able to deal with our junk. So it says in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, earlier in that chapter, if we say we have no sin, we're liars and the truth is not in us. And I know there's some wonky Christian teaching about how when you believe in Jesus, sin is a complete non-issue and you don't ever have to confess sin. And I think that's total nonsense. We still encounter all sorts of misguided behaviors and darkness and other issues in our lives. Well, when they come to the surface, we need to deal with them. Some of us need professional help with some of the disorders that we might have. We shouldn't be ashamed of that, because traumas of the past can do things to our minds that we need help with under a physician's guidance. Again, nothing to be ashamed about that. We need to deal with our stuff, not excuse it, not cover it over. And so one of my issues was I thought if I was just honest about my stuff, all would be good. And I began to see, there's a way that I could be honest about certain behaviors, but never really deal with them, and God will forgive me. And that really doesn't cut it. We really got to get serious about our stuff in our lives. I hope that helps, Matthew.
Thank you, Dad. Lori has a quick question. Lori asks, can you create a list of all those scriptures that you cited tonight, please?
Yes. So for the course people, I sent you a link to a handout that's a table of Old Testament prophecies and New Testament fulfillments. It includes what I shared and more. And I'll put that link in the YouTube video description probably by tomorrow.
Thank you, Dad. Dawn, who identifies as being from Ottawa, but originally from Outremont, says, John, what has he done for these last 40 years?
What has John done?
Okay. In 4 seconds, right? After the events that Alan described with the twins and the dog, we were living in secrecy as far as our Christianity from my girlfriend's parents. And one night she decided that she would announce to them that she is a believer and so was her sister, and so were her cousins, and so were their friends. It was really quite the movement. And her parents, who kindly had me living with them while I was in Canada, asked me to leave the country, and I did. I found out after leaving the country that there was a contract out on my life for my evangelism work in Montreal. So I was glad to get out when I did. I went on to study for the ministry. And I went through all the years of college for pre-seminary and Christian education. And turned out that the church could not place a Jewish person in ministry at that time, those many years ago. They were not willing to have a Jewish person in the church, serving the church. So I ended up not going to church work, but into salvaging my father's business and a number of other adventures, which can wait for another time.
Thank you, John. I hope that answers Don's question.
Thank you, John. John, I'm so sorry for what you experienced in multiple avenues. Yeah, but I'm grateful that you've persevered and are with us today.
I'm being embraced by the church that I'm with now, and we're well past that. But it's there are some people that aren't enlightened, and I was trying to get into the mainstream, so I really wasn't with a lot of Jewish Christians, Jewish believers. I was on the other side, and it was very hard for them to accept me coming into that realm.
Well, John, we love you and accept you. That partly on the same question, maybe of identity. This question from my dad. Anonymous asks, what do you call your children? Do you call them Jewish Christians? Do you call them messianic Jews? Or do you just call them Christians? What are your children? What is their identity?
Yeah, well, it's similar. When people ask me what I call myself, and we might have dealt with this recently too, in our course time, that it depends who I'm talking to. And so I like the term Jewish believer. As you know, because of how the Lord has led us, we have most of our life as believers have been with non-Jewish believers rather than a more Jewish context. We tried to start a messianic congregation in Montreal. That didn't work out. And during that time period, the Lord actually made it clear to me that we were to be part of the bigger family of believers. And of course, the majority group is not Jewish. And so our kids have tended to pick up the lingo of the people that were around them. And the most common term to describe believers is Christian. Even though when I first became a believer, we were attending a community called a Plymouth Brethren Assembly, and they prefer to use the word believer, which I really like because it's generic, and you can also explain what you mean instead of being labeled. Because when you say Christian, it means certain things to certain people, which may not be accurate. And so I've encouraged my kids to at least use the word believer. It's up to them what they want to call themselves. And so maybe you could answer further or better, Daniel.
I'll leave it at that. I want to fit in more questions. Kay has a question from Psalm 22. Kay writes, Psalm 22 and other Psalms contain prophetic messages about the Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus. Would King David have been classified as a prophet?
Oh boy. I'm trying to think if he does get called that somewhere. Abraham does in the Old Testament. I'd have to look it up. I can get back to you, because I think he does get called a prophet, maybe in the book of Acts, but I'd have to look that up.
Well, in the meantime, Anonymous has another question. Thank you so much for being real, says Anonymous. What part did the Holy Spirit play in your story, and when did you recognize it as such?
Keep trying to understand the question as best I can. But so from the beginning, there's an understanding of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, because he's in the Bible. But the Anonymous might be referring to a particular role the Holy Spirit is said to play in the life of the believer, particularly in terms of how he endows us with particular abilities in God. And some of those things are a little more sensational than others, like being able to speak the word of God, like prophecy. There's the New Testament speaks about the gift of tongues, doing miracles, and that sort of thing. primarily there's the work of life, the life-giving work of the Holy Spirit, which all believers tend to understand. But there is this other, call it practical side of the gift of the Holy Spirit, as referred to in the book of Acts, when he comes at the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, Pentecost, that then equips the believer to be an effective witness to Yeshua and to do his work in the world. And for me, the early years of being a believer, that was not really discussed. Eventually, it's a whole other story how in 1985, I went to a conference called Signs and Wonders in Church Growth. The teacher was John Wimber, and he provided a very sound biblical understanding of the Holy Spirit's work. And so it's not, can I say this? It's not overly a big deal. It's the work of God's Spirit in equipping us and empowering us to be the people of God is core to all believers' lives. And some people talk about it in different ways.
Thank you. Also, a thank you to a gentleman in the Q&A box. His name is R. And R provided Acts 2:29-31, which refers to David as a prophet.
I thought so.
Thank
you, R.
Thank you, R.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. There's a question from Lori. She asked, have your brothers and your father believed in Yeshua since you and Robin found him?
My mother was the only other person in our two families that ever came to believe.
Next question from Jan. Read John's experience, says Jan. How do you think the broader church views Jewish believers today? Is there a lot of misunderstanding about Messianic Jews?
Yeah, and I'll use the term Messianic Jew to refer to Jewish believers. Some people use the term for Jewish believers and even non-Jewish believers who attend a Messianic Jewish style congregation. So I'll use Messianic Jews as synonym for Jewish believers. The experience among Christians for Jewish believers is very diverse. I know what I've experienced, and me and my family, because we've been all over the country, we've been in various believing communities. There have been all sorts of everything from ignorance to being the object of some pretty bad, in poor taste jokes, and even some smatterings of out and out, what I would call anti-Semitism. And so John's experience isn't that uncommon. What he experienced to his face may not be that common, but there is underlying anti-Jewish sentiment within the church. It's often fueled by how the New Testament is taught still. And I try my best to try to counteract that by helping people see what the Bible actually says, so that we can learn to be brothers and sisters together.
Well, thanks, Dad. Well, I think that though there are more questions incoming now, I think here at 8:46 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Daylight Time, I think that we will need to bring it to a close here. But this is week 17 of my dad's Old Testament survey, as he's been taking us week after week through the understanding the Old Testament. And next week, I believe we'll continue on with the wisdom literature. Is that right, Dad?
That's correct. We're starting with the next week will be dedicated to the Psalms.
I'm looking forward to it. It's my birthday and I'm not skipping it. I had people close to me saying, what if you asked your dad to skip out that night so you have the full evening for your birthday? But you know what? I would like nothing more than to celebrate my birthday in the Old Testament with my dad and all of you. So I hope that you'll all be there. And if anybody is watching maybe on YouTube and you're not registered for the course, I do recommend that you get in touch with my dad. And to see, I hope there'll be more courses, more maybe podcast things in the works perhaps. And I don't want you to miss it. I'll be there and I hope you can be there too. I think you can connect with my dad at alangilman.ca. I trust he'll correct me if I'm wrong, alangilman.ca, or you can just track us down anywhere. Thank you so much for taking your evening to be with us, or if you're tuning in from Australia, as some are, your morning to be with us. We're so grateful for your time. So grateful to you, Dad, for sharing so vulnerably your story. I really appreciate how my dad doesn't just share about how, and he's been like this my whole life. He doesn't just share like, oh, I used to have some struggles and battles, and now I'm just, life is fine. But he's so honest about how even to this day, he continues to have to wrestle with his own frailty and his own his own challenges. And yet God is faithful through it all. Whatever you're going through, wherever you are in life, my dad and I both are convinced that the same God that has been so faithful to him and has been so faithful to me loves you so much and is right here to be walking with you through all the different stuff that you're going through, whether in this specific global pandemic season or whatever it might be that you're walking through. So I hope to see you next week on my birthday, and I'm so glad that you're here tonight. Have a great night.